The Australian team which visited England in 1930 to recover the Ashes, a task in which they succeeded, contained a name which was to become as famous in cricket as that of W.G. Grace. The reputation of Don Bradman had preceded him, the young man from up-country in New South Wales, who Australia said was as good as Hobbs, a claim ridiculous, of course, to Englishmen at that time. Don came here and immediately started making centuries. He'd scored a century in both innings in the Melbourne Test against England on the MCC Tour in 1928-29. Now he's scored centuries in England, at Nottingham, Leeds, Lords and the Oval, missing only Manchester. And he's been scoring them ever since. 19 in 8 series of tests against England in the course of 20 years, from which you have to subtract 6 years of war.
Oh, Mr. Ruth, will you come on over, please? Mr. Ruth? Our sorority has challenged the boys' fraternity's 2 baseball game, and we wondered how much you'd charge to coach us for the game. We've just got to win.
Why, it'd be a pleasure. Oh, just a minute. I got to see my manager.
Oh, isn't it grand?
Honey, do you mind?
I overheard what the girls said. Certainly, dear. I think it would be very nice.
Okay. Mrs. Ruth said it's okay. Now, if you girls will be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, we'll get started.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Ruth.
Don't forget, 10 o'clock. I'm glad to get the chance to coach you. I've often wondered why girls haven't played more baseball. It's a healthy, outdoor exercise, and it's no more difficult than any other sport they take part in. Now, where's the pitcher?
Oh, I'm the pitcher.
Why'd you stay here? Boys, you sure the girls were to play out there?
For those of us who are history fans, there are certain types of historic events for which we each have our own particular affinity for our own particular reasons. And one of my favorite types of historic event is when the lives of 2 great men from different fields of endeavor briefly intersect, if only just for a period of minutes or hours. And there's 2 of those events by which I'm particularly fascinated that I want to talk about today. One is the meeting of Admiral Lord Nelson and the future Duke of Wellington in September of 1805. The other is the meeting of Babe Ruth and Sir Donald Bradman, who was just plain old Don Bradman in those days, in July of 1932. And I realize many in my audience won't know who Sir Donald Bradman is, but we will fix that. It's Thursday, the 10th of July. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we encourage you to globalize the enchilada intifada by visiting your local Del Taco today. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about one-armed, one-eyed admirals. Specifically, Horatio, 1st Viscount Nelson, 1st Duke of Bronte, Vice Admiral of the White, who, when he showed up for his meeting with Lord Castlereagh, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, at the Colonial Office in Downing Street on the morning of 12 September 1805, he didn't know he had less than a month to live, that he had a date with destiny coming up at Trafalgar. He didn't know these were the last couple of days he would ever spend on dry land, but he did know that he was Britain's greatest naval commander since Sir Francis Drake, possibly the greatest ever, and he had no compunction about telling other people that, if they should happen to be in any doubt. Major General Sir Arthur Wellesley, on the other hand, who had only just recently gained his knighthood and holds no peerage as yet, was as much a contrast in style and personality to Admiral Lord Nelson as to be akin to oil and water. He is 10 years younger than Nelson, far less accomplished at this stage. He's won an impressive series of victories in India related to the Mysore Rebellion, impressive enough to get him invested as a Knight of the Bath, and while he's well respected in military circles, his name still isn't very widely known to the general public. And while Nelson has a taste for the finer things in life when he is on shore, Wellesley does not. When he's on campaign, he goes to bed early and sleeps in a basic officer-issue cot. And when he's not on campaign, even 40 years later when he's the freaking prime minister and the nation's foremost military hero, he still goes to bed early and still sleeps on a basic officer-issue cot, which sits next to the prime minister's fancy feather bed that he refuses to use. Major General Wellesley has a separate appointment that same day with Lord Castlereagh on the morning of September 12th, which I guess we can categorize as a fun bit of historical happenstance. And when Lord Nelson arrives for his own appointment, he takes a seat next to this young Major General. He has no reason to know or care who this guy is, even though the 2 of them will go down in history as Britain's greatest naval commander and greatest land commander, respectively. and he strikes up a conversation. A conversation that is all about Nelson and Nelson's greatness and Nelson's achievements. And the future Duke of Wellington finds this all pretty off-putting, annoying even, listening to this one-armed egomaniac prattle on about himself. But he outranks me, so I guess I don't have the option of excusing myself and going to sit somewhere else. Just gonna have to sit here and listen to it until he decides he's finished, I guess. At some point, Nelson gets up to go use the loo or something, and both men's aides have been watching from the opposite side of the room, so one of Nelson's aides pulls him aside and says, "Sir, that man you've been talking to, that's Major General Wellesley, the guy who just won all those victories in India, and there are some in the War Department who think he is the man who can go and defeat Napoleon on the continent. In fact, the reason he's here today is probably for Lord Castlereagh to offer him that very assignment." So now Nelson realizes that he's made a bit of an ass of himself. But how was he supposed to know? This guy was so quiet and unassuming. I figured he was just some desk general and not a distinguished battlefield commander in his own right. So Nelson goes back over, sits down, and makes his apologies to Wellesley. "Sorry about that, dude. Didn't know who you were. My bad." And they proceeded to converse for a further quarter of an hour or so before Nelson was called in for his meeting. And obviously the two men never met again because Nelson had a date with death and with victory and his coming apotheosis in just a few weeks' time. So there was no record of what Nelson's impression of Wellesley might have been. But Wellesley, he lived for a further half century, so he was able to speak and write quite extensively on his impressions of Nelson. On the first part of the encounter, when Nelson didn't know who he was, he said he found the Admiral, quote, "so vain and silly as to surprise and almost disgust me." But on the second part of the encounter, after Nelson knew who he was and started asking pertinent questions about the military situation on the continent, Wellington later said, quote, "I don't know that I ever had a conversation that interested me more. I was struck by his depth of knowledge and his ability to discuss complex matters as an equal." And there were a lot of parallels to that. When Babe Ruth met Don Bradman in July of 1932, Ruth is 37 years old at that point. He's not putting up the same sort of video game numbers that he was 8 or 10 years prior, but he is still one of the top 4 or 5 hitters in the game easily, and there's not really any dispute that he is the best that ever lived, as there still isn't today. The only part of the Babe Ruth legend that still hasn't been written yet at this point is the called shot, which happens in the World Series in that very same season of 1932, and he never called his shot anyway, but it doesn't matter. It's a fun story, and it's part of the legend, so who cares? Don Bradman is only 23 years old. He's only been playing Test cricket for less than half a decade at that point, but already he is putting up numbers that nobody ever conceived of. And even at that young age, he is already widely regarded as the greatest Test batsman who ever lived, as he still is today, and there is not really any argument on that either. Why? Because the numbers do not lie. A Test century, meaning 100 runs scored in one innings, one at bat, if you will, to use the baseball term, is the benchmark of greatness in that sport. Lots of guys have very respectable Test cricket careers without ever scoring a century. Don Bradman averaged a century over a 20-year-long career. Well, technically that's not true. He fell 1/600th of a run short of averaging a century because he got bowled for a duck in his last ever innings. So he finishes with a Test average of 99.94. To put that number in perspective, they played Test cricket for 50 years before Bradman. They've played Test cricket for 75 years after Bradman, and nobody else in history has come within 30 runs of that average. In other words, he averaged 100, and nobody else has ever averaged 70. There simply is no other example in any sport, either team sports or individual sports, of one competitor being that far statistically superior to all other competitors before and since. It is such a yawning chasm between best and second best that to this day there isn't any controversy in the cricketing world about Bradman being the greatest of all time. Saying the name Bradman in the presence of a cricket fan produces a reverent response that is not unlike when you say the name of Muhammad in the presence of a Muslim. So what brings Don Bradman to New York City in the summer of 1932? Well, he's just gotten married to his wife, Jenny, and they are on an extended honeymoon, and the Australian Cricket Board has told him, if you have a chance to hobnob with any big American celebrities and promote our sport, we encourage you to try and do that, which probably wouldn't have been Bradman's preference. He was sort of a shy, retiring type. One might almost call him socially awkward. He always hated the publicity that was associated with his greatness, but if his bosses tell him he should do a thing for the benefit of his country and his sport, he is going to do the thing. And as serendipity would have it, it just so happens that Babe Ruth is on the injured list with a strained hamstring during the time when Mr. and Mrs. Bradman are coming to New York. So Ruth goes to Colonel Rupert, the owner of the Yankees, and he says, "Jake, I know the normal practice is for injured players to be in uniform on the bench in the dugout during games, but I would like your permission to host this young Australian cricketer for one game up in your private box next week, if that's okay." Now, personality-wise, these two men couldn't have been any more starkly different from one another. Ruth is the loud, brash, obnoxious American who celebrates excess and gluttony. Bradman is the quiet, reserved Australian who, when he is not playing cricket or practicing cricket, likes nothing better than hanging out at home with his wife. But by all accounts, the two of them got along famously that day, and they had a delightful time enjoying each other's company for a few hours. And Bradman could be viewed as a historical visionary for his impressions of baseball on that day. He really liked the fact that a baseball game can be concluded in a couple of hours with each man getting several chances to come to bat. He remarked that perhaps cricket has a thing or two to learn from baseball, for in those days, the shorter forms of cricket don't yet exist. Those don't start existing until the 1970s. In Bradman's day, the multi-day form of cricket was the only form of cricket. Today, you've got one-day internationals, then you've got the T20 format, which reduces the match length to around 3 hours and is, by far, today, the most profitable format of the game. Of his impressions of baseball, Bradman said, quote, "Each afternoon's play stands on its own. Yes, cricket could learn a lot from baseball. There is more snap and dash to baseball." Ruth, for his part, he came away impressed by how quickly Bradman picked up on the nuances of our game, despite never having seen it played before. At one point, the Yankees turned a double play on the White Sox, and Bradman exclaimed, "That's a double play," despite no one having explained the term to him previously. And I know it couldn't have resulted from this meeting because it happens far too late in Ruth's career, but I have long wondered if there was a cricket influence somewhere along the line in Ruth's hitting style. Because when you look at certain film clips of Ruth hitting the ball, when he has identified that he's getting a curveball, he often takes a big stride forward from the back of the box all the way to the front so he can take the ball where he wants to take it. Sometimes he even crosses his feet in the process of doing that, which is the last thing you would ever teach a young baseball player to do. I mean, the number one rule of hitting in baseball, at least according to the conventional wisdom, is you don't move your back foot for any reason ever. But here we have Babe Ruth, the greatest hitter who ever lived, playing shots that are not considered technically correct in baseball, but which would be considered technically flawless if he was a cricketer facing a spin bowler. And for a long time I've been fascinated by that, because Ruth is the only hitter I have ever seen hit that way, but nobody ever seems to talk about it or wonder why it is, which is strange to me. So I am sticking with my theory that Ruth must have met some other cricketer back in the early part of his career and borrowed a technique or two, because I just can't think of a better explanation for what I see before me. And as much as some history fans would prefer to be a fly on the wall for a major battle or a major speech or some other momentous world-shaking event, I would prefer to be a fly on the wall for one of those brief, singular meetings between great men who toil in different but related professional vineyards. I'm done. That's all I've got. See you next time. Get off my lawn.